Good afternoon, Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay, our HOD Dr. Salim Zaved, Department of History, Presidency University, Dr. Rituparna Rai, respected professors, fellow peers, and everyone present here. The Department of History, Presidency University, cordially welcomes you all to the inaugural lecture of the annual lecture series organized by the Kolkata Partition Museum Trust in collaboration with Presidency University. We are extremely honored to have Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay, our honorable guest and esteemed speaker for the day, and Dr. Rituparna Roy, the initiator of the Kolkata Partition Museum project, with us today. On behalf of the Department of History, Presidency University, I now invite Dr. Rituparna Roy on stage to talk about the annual lecture series and the Kolkata Partition Museum Trust.
Good afternoon, everyone. I've been very nervous actually because I have not met a crowd like this for a lecture before. And anyway, so Kolkata Partition Museum Trust has instituted an annual lecture series this year, and Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay's lecture today is the inaugural lecture of that series. On behalf of the trust, almost the entire trust is here. Dr. John Bishingurtu, Professor Tapatibu Thakurta, Shri Obhijit Pathok, there is one other, Srimati Lilina Chatterjee. On behalf of the trust, I welcome you all to this lecture, and I thank the Department of History, Presidency University, for agreeing to collaborate with us, and most importantly, to host this event. You know, when we were thinking of instituting this lecture, the very first name that came to our minds was of Shekharda. And there are reasons for that. The first and most primary reason is very obvious. It is because of his immense contribution to the field of partition studies related to Bengal, which has been immense and ongoing. And I'm not talking here of from classic to partition. We were just having a conversation in which he was saying that he's almost identified with this book and everybody reads it, whether it's a history student or not. But also because, well, this is, I'm a little nervous about talking about history in front of history experts. But we do know that in the very many turns that partition historiography has taken in the last few decades, he has brought in at least two. He has brought caste into the picture, foregrounding the experiences of Dalits in partition, and he has also emphasized the importance of decolonization in South Asia and the socio-political ramifications of that in the region over several books. In fact, his latest book is yet to come out. One has already come and one will be available in September, October, Caste in Bengal. So the thing is, this is obviously the prime reason, inviting an eminent historian in the field that we are working in. But there is also another associated, and for us an equally important reason. It is that of our association with him. So when I first thought about this project way back in 2016, and I was still living in the Netherlands then, the very first person I approached, the first person I wrote to was Shekhar. After sharing the idea with my parents, that is, and I still remember it was Poila Bolshak, the day I got his response. It was enthusiastic, encouraging, but also with a cautionary note about the ambitiousness of the project and the possible challenges. Soon after, we were working towards a partition conference in India to be held at Indian Museum to commemorate the 70th year of India's partition. And that was possible because of the involvement of John Bishingurtu, Dr. John Bishingurtu, and it was also supported by Victoria Memorial Hall. I mentioned the conference because that conference is a very important moment in the journey of KPM, because that is where I first broached the idea of a museum. So you could say that that was the originary moment of KPM in India. The trust that has been steering that project since was born a year later, but that conference is a very important moment. So for both Shekharda's contribution in the field and his sustained support of this project, we thought that the most appropriate person to start off this lecture series would be him. I want to end by saying that, this is just not a lecture. I don't need to say it is the realities here. This is ultimately also a reunion of sorts. It's a reunion of his students, friends, associates, colleagues, and I think this lecture being sold out, and please pardon me for this very commercial term, the reason, the lecture being sold out is a powerful attestation of the power and reach of scholarship. So I'm as eagerly looking forward to the lecture as you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy, for briefing us about the project and the annual lecture series. Now, I would like to call upon stage Orko Protimbala, Research Scholar, Department of History, Presidency University, to introduce our speaker for the day, Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay.
Good afternoon, Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay, our honorable guest, Professor Ritupurna, respected professors, fellow peers, and everyone present here. The Kolkata Partition Museum Trust, in collaboration with the Department of History, Presidency University, Kolkata, welcome everyone to the inaugural lecture of the institution of an annual lecture series. Our speaker today needs no introduction. We all have grown up studying books he wrote, mostly in our days as undergraduate and postgraduate students. His book, as ma'am also mentioned, From Policy to Partition and After, is a classic and will remain so for a long, long time. I'm sure students present here will be able to relate to this very much. This book is so popular that it has been translated into different languages, including Bangla and Hindi. Professor Bandyopadhyay completed his Bachelor of Arts in History from this very institution in 1972, and then completed his Masters from the University of Calcutta in 1974 with a gold medal. He received his doctorate in History from the University of Calcutta in 1988. The title of his dissertation was Social Mobility in Bengal in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He is currently the Emeritus Professor of History at the Victoria University of Wellington. He previously taught at Ramakrishna Mission Residential College from 1976 to 1978, after which he was a lecturer at the University of Kolkata from 1978 to 1979. He taught history at the University of Calcutta from 1979 to 1992 and became a reader in 1986. He was also a Charles Wallace Fellow in 1991 at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He then went on to become a professor in history at Victoria University, Wellington, and continued teaching there till 2020. He was also the founding director of the New Zealand India Research Institute. He has held many academic positions throughout his career. Currently, he is serving as the co-editor of New Zealand Journal of Asian Studies. He has served as a member of the editorial boards of different journals, namely Journal of Modern Indian History, Contemporary Voice of Dalit, Journal of South Asian Development, etc. He was awarded the Robindra Sriti Puraskar in May 2014 for the book Decolonization in South Asia, Meanings of Freedom in Post-Independence West Bengal, 1947 to 1952. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. Bandyopadhyay's primary research interest is in the history of nationalism and the caste system in colonial and post-colonial India. He is also interested in the history of Indian migration and the Indian diaspora. He has written 7 books in the English language and 2 in the Bengali language. Edited or co-edited 13 books and published more than 50 books, chapters and journals. Among his most well-known works of the last decade and a half, mention may be made of Decolonization in South Asia, Meanings of Freedom in Post-Independence West Bengal, 1947 to 1952, অষ্টাদশ শতকের মুঘল সংকট ও আধুনিক ইতিহাস চিন্তা, Caste, Culture and Hegemony, Social Dominance in Colonial Bengal, Caste, Protest and Identity in Colonial India, The Namasudras of Bengal, 1872 to 1947, Caste, Politics and the Raj, Bengal, 1872 to 1937, and of course, From Policy to Partition and After, A History of Modern India. His edited volumes include Nationalist Movement in India, a reader, and Decolonization and the Politics of Transition in South Asia. His co-edited books include Religion and Modernity in India and Indians and the Antipodes, Network, Boundaries and Circulation. His most recent publications are Caste and Partition in Bengal, the story of Dalit refugees, 1946 to 1961, and Caste in Bengal, histories of hierarchy, exclusion and resistance, co-edited with Professor Tonika Sarkar. This book will be available in the market in October. It's been 50 years since he graduated from the Department of History, Presidency College, and we welcome him back to his old haunt of many memories. We are very honored to have a historian of his stature with us, and we eagerly look forward to his lecture.
On behalf of the Department of History, Presidency University, I now invite Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay to deliver the much-awaited lecture.
Friends, colleagues, of course, Rituparna, students, ladies and gentlemen. I feel a bit overwhelmed right at this moment by seeing this gathering. I've never had such an overfull auditorium to address. It is also very overwhelming to come back to presidency after a few decades. As it has already been mentioned, I graduated from the history department of what was then Presidency College about 50 years ago. And I last came into this building several decades ago, possibly mid 30 to 40 years. And today, coming into this building, I was trying to locate where was the room number 17, where the history seminar was located, where is the library, and I was a bit shocked to see that the portico where most of my time was spent was gone. So it's a bit overwhelming to come to this building after so many years. So I'm grateful, and I would like to begin by thanking the Kolkata Partition Museum for inviting me to give this lecture. I feel honored, and I'm also thankful to the faculty and students of the History Department of Presidency University for hosting this lecture and giving me this opportunity to come back. Now, as I said, I graduated 50 years ago, and about 25 years before that, India achieved independence. And today we are celebrating the 75 years of independence in India. But we do not and we must not forget that decolonization in India was a twin event. Independence came with partition, and which was unprecedented in world history, as it kind of affected so many people at that time and ever since. So the event had a long prehistory as well as a prolonged aftermath. So when the Ratcliffe Line was announced on 17th of August, demarcating the boundaries between the two nation states, it was meant to solve the problem of the Muslim minorities once for all. But it didn't. Instead, it created new minorities, that is, non-Muslims in Pakistan and the Muslims who chose to live in India. And the political leaders who had agreed to this division had not thought over what would happen to these new minorities created by partition. But the problem is, as Arjun Appadurai reminded us, the fear of small numbers. He has a book with this title, and he argues that the fear of small numbers or minorities is the Achilles' heel of the modern nation states. So when the two nation states were created, both shared the same fear of this residual minorities, same anxieties about the racial ethnic purity of their nationhood. And hence what started was a mindless violence, which in modern terms one might call ethnic cleansing, leading to death destruction and displacement. No one knows exactly what the numbers were, but informed estimates would say that about 1 million or more people died, 12 to 14 million people were displaced and became refugees on both sides of the new international boundary called the Radcliffe Line. So Radcliffe Line had different meanings to different groups of people depending on who they were and where they stood at that particular moment of time. And therefore, different groups of people responded to it in very different ways. So we cannot really conceptualize the event in a straightforward straitjacket. It had many complexities, many nuances within this story. Now, it is not surprising, therefore, that partition has been studied in details extensively by both professional historians as well as by amateur researchers. I tried to do a web-based search through my university library website, and it returned a list of nearly 100,000 books and articles written in different languages. So it shows that it has been studied by different people from different ideological perspectives and from different religious, ethnic positions. At the initial stage, this historiography looked at the event of partition, why it happened, how it happened, and tried to identify who were responsible for it and who was to blame. But then eventually there was a shift in partition historiography where we find that the focus shifted to the experiences of partition, that is how people experienced the violence that was unleashed, what was the experience of migrating, leaving their ancestral homes and migrating to an unknown future and struggling for citizenship. All this experience became the new focus of the new historiography. The old historiography is often criticized as being statist historiography. It was trying to construct statist collectives, whereas the new historiography looks at the day-to-day sufferings of the people who went through that event in different capacities, either as victims or perpetrators or even bystanders. But reflecting on this shift in historiography, Garendra Pandey argued in his book that, I'm just reading one sentence, it has turned aside from an exclusive concentration on high politics and the question of ultimate responsibility to reopen other issues crucial to an understanding of our recent history and politics, the suffering of bewildered and angry men, women and children in 1947 and since. However, many historians in recent years have questioned this understanding of the role of high politics in partition. A number of studies have now shown that movement at the grassroots level, the people, the movements, the agitations, the riots, they also fed into the process. And there was some kind of an organic connection between the high politics of the leaders and the aspirations and desires and dreams of the people at the bottom. And they were expecting various things from the partition or the whole idea of Pakistan. So we cannot really detach one from the other. And I would argue that the old historiography, which was looking at the event, looking at the causes, and was asking why it happened, is also important, because that is a part of how we remember partition. That is also a strategy how the two successor states defined or tried to define who their natural citizens were and tried to identify who their others are. So when it comes to the question of memorializing partition, I think that question should come back. And that question comes back, and unless we address that question, we cannot safely memorialize partition as an event. So what I will try to do is to reread old history in the light of new research. The old history, which was purely focusing on colonial policy of divide and rule and so on, that from there, the understanding of that prehistory of partition and immediate pre-partition events have shifted a lot. So what I'll try to do in this lecture is to reread that old history and try to come to my own understanding of what really led to partition and how do we memorialize partition. Now, in the introduction to his edited collection, The Partition of Memory, Subir Kaul argued that the partition of India was premised on what he called, I quote, the violent separateness of Hindus and Muslims, unquote. However, for Bengal, it is difficult to pin down the period when this violent separateness actually started, and when it came to a point of no return, which made partition inevitable. If we look very briefly at the prehistory, I will be very quickly surveying the situation in the light of the new research. If we look at the beginning of this story, it has been argued that it mainly started with the emergence of a small Muslim elite in the late 19th century, whereas historians like Qasim Mursid would argue that this Muslim counterintelligentsia was not powerful or active until 1920s or 1930s. And this counterintelligentsia was operating within a new public space created by colonial rule, and there were two intellectual drivers behind this emergence of a separate Muslim political identity. One was a response to a very revitalized Hindu revivalist movement, but more importantly, the more important driver was the new intellectual cognitive enterprises of colonial rule, through its ethnographic surveys, census enumeration, the colonial regime tried to enumerate, map, identify religious communities in terms of their numbers and location. And note that it introduced the modern demographic concept of majority and minority, and it also introduced the developmental concept of being backward or advanced. So what happened as a result of the production of this colonial knowledge, this Muslim counterintelligentsia could see that they were, within the Bengal context, a majority population, whereas they were a minority within the All India context. But according to all developmental indices, like education or employment, they were backward vis-a-vis the more advanced Bhadralok Hindus or upper caste or Savarna Hindus. I won't kind of aggregate all Hindus into one community, as this cognitive exercise was also identifying different fissures within the Hindu community as well. So what happened as a result? This counterintelligentsia, if we use Tajin Murshid's term, they kind of identified that in spite of being the majority, they were lagging behind. And this led to political action, forming of organizations, forming of or organizing mass movements, etc., etc. And of course, colonial rule encouraged them in two ways. In one way, they kind of intellectually stereotyped them as a backward community, whereas the entire Muslim community was not backward. The Muslim community in Bengal was also very stratified. On the other hand, they began to give them more and more privileges and concessions, finally partitioning Bengal in 1905, which was believed to be in the interest of the Muslims. So what happened? As a result of that, the first partition of Bengal in 1905, I think, was the first instance when this rift came to the open public space. When the Savarna Hindu nationalists wanted to organize the Swadeshi movement against the first partition of Bengal, they faced initially reluctance from these communities, and these communities included both the Muslims as well as Dalit peasants of Eastern Bengal. As I tried to show in one of my books on the Namshudras, both these two communities opposed the Swadeshi movement, and in my view this was the first Dalit Muslim alliance which kind of confronted the power of the Bhadralok, Savarna Bhadralok elite. And when the Swadeshi nationalists wanted to force these people to observe their boycott program, they faced stiff resistance. And by 1907, communal riots began to take place in the Eastern Bengal countryside, and Tagore wrote a series of articles where he argued that after neglecting the interests of these backward communities for years and decades, you cannot expect these people to come forward with enthusiasm to respond to your movement. So what happened? This was the first exposure, I believe, of the public rift between the two communities, but it was not really the point of no return. So how do we from here move to the point of no return? Some of the modern historians, I would mention here P.K. Dotto and more recently Andrew Sartori and Nilesh Bose, have argued that this mainly happened in the decades after the annulment of the first partition. This happened because the Hindu political elite began to be aggressive against the Muslims for different reasons. The first reason was the Muslims were held responsible for the failure of the Swadeshi movement. The second, as P.K. Dotto has argued, there was a growing Hindu common sense that the Muslim community was growing larger through conversion, and this would put the minority Hindus in further trouble. At this point of time, the Muslim community, as Sartori mentions, also became identified more with interregional and global religious identities. So as a result of this, the two communities began, I believe, to move farther away from each other, but it was not serious at that moment, and it could be bridged. And there were attempts to bridge. There is no point to think that the Hindu nationalist leaders could not understand that. In a recent I believe is a major book in this field, Shemonti Ghosh's book on other nationalisms. Ghosh argues that in this period, leaders like Chittaranjan Das or Bipin Pal were thinking of nationalism in a very different way. Das's thinking of nationalism was that of a federation, not of a centralized state, but a loose federation, emphasis on regional autonomy. And this idea of federation was extended to cover also the internal demographics of Bengal. Das believed that the society is composed of various communities. Each community had its own interests, each community had its own identity, each community had its own aspirations. And the nationalist movement had to incorporate all these competing identities and interests into a composite federal whole. And with that purpose in mind, in 1923, he negotiated the Bengal Pact. The Bengal Pact argued and stipulated that the election to the legislature will be according to the proportion of the population of the two communities within the Bengal population, and more importantly, in terms of government jobs, 55% of the government jobs would be reserved for the Muslims until their position improves in this kind of field. But the problem was, the leaders like Das or Pal were still exceptional. While the Muslim middle class welcomed Bengal Pact of 1923, many of the conservative elements within the Bengali Hindu society believed that this would harm the Hindus. And what is also very significant, in the following Congress session in Kolkata, the Bengal Pact, Chittaranjan Das presented the Bengal Pact as the Bengal's solution, which could be implemented on an all-India basis as a solution to the communal alienation. But the Congress session rejected it. One could, Shemonti argues, that one could perhaps counterfactually argue that if it was accepted, the history of India might have been different. Who knows? But what I'm trying to suggest, that new research shows that there were possibilities of bridging the gulf, while at the same time the gulf was expanding. Now, moving forward, the nationalist historians, when we were students, we would read, I'm not going into names, that one of the major factors responsible for this divide was the colonial policy of divide and rule, of course. The colonial government granted separate electorate in the more elementary reform of 1909, and then in the communal award, this was further entrenched, and it became part of the constitutional arrangement. But one should remember that, and many of the new historians have argued this, that just blaming the colonial policy would not explain what was happening. More things were happening which we need not ignore. I would say that many of the modern historians argue that we should not take it as a natural outcome of a clash of civilization between the Hindus and the Islam. But at the same time, historians like Gilmartin and more recently Venkat Dhulipal have argued that there was a growing Islamization of the Muslim masses in North India, which we should not ignore. For Bengal also, a long time before Tajul Hashmi had pointed out that following the Khilafat movement, in fact, Khilafat movement had resulted in further Islamization of the Muslim masses, but following that, there was a very well-orchestrated movement in the eastern Bengal countryside to Islamize the politics of the East Bengali Muslim peasants. And in response to that, as Muslim mobilization was growing, historians like Jeffrey Lowe and others have shown that Hindu mobilization also started. From around the same time, 1924, Hindu Mahasabha started the Hindu mobilization move, and particularly it was most powerful in the East Bengal countryside, and as a result, the two communities were developing more and more their identities, which were coming to clash. In 1924 began the communal riots in various parts of India on various issues like music before mosque and so on. And Congress could not do anything, could not take a position against this communalization because of the lobbies within the Congress itself, and this further aggravated the whole situation. Against this backdrop of political othering, the Communal Award of 1932, later incorporated in the Government of India Act of 1935, crystallized the minority position of the Muslims by entrenching the principle of separate electorate. Musharraf Hasan argued that the election that followed in 1937 and the subsequent ministry formation by Congress constituted the watershed moment in the history of Muslim alienation from mainstream nationalism. In the election of 1937, the Congress secured a massive victory to form government in 8 out of 11 provinces, and thereafter sought to marginalize the Muslim League, which had suffered badly in the election. The refusal to share power with the League in the minority provinces generated among the North Indian Muslims a fear that they would be permanently repressed by a brute majority, and so when the Congress government resigned in 1939, Jinnah rejoiced it as deliverance. It was from here, Hasan argues, that the road to partition began. But I would put it in a different way, that minority politics worked differently in Bengal, where the Muslims were the majority. Here, as Joy Chatterjee argued in her book, Bengal Divided, following the Communal Award and the Pune Pact of 1932, the Bhadralok political elite, who dominated Bengal politics until now, found their power gradually slipping out of their grip, as they were reduced to a minority in the legislature due to separate electorate for the Muslims and reserved seats for the scheduled castes. The effects of Great Depression also affected their power of landlordism. This had led to their renewed efforts to consolidate the Hindu political constituency, resulting in a resurgence of what Chatterjee has called Hindu communalism. Bidut Chakraborty, on the other hand, has observed the rise of both Hindu communalism and Muslim communalism in the period between 1932 and 1947. Suranjan Das too, in a recent article, has observed a convergence of elite and popular communalism among both Muslims and Hindus during the period that is between 1932 and 1947. At the other end of the spectrum, Chanda Chatterjee, in her recent book, has noticed only the disturbing manifestation of Muslim communalism. However, some of the recent researchers have suggested that the polarization was not yet clearly defined in the 1930s. During the 1930s, A.K. Fazlul Haq mobilized the Muslim and Hindu lower caste peasants under the banner of the Krishak Praja Party around more class-based issues and did pretty well in the election of 1937, undermining the position of the Muslim League. But neither the Praja Party nor any other party had a clear majority, and so for forming a government, it initially started negotiating with the Congress. But when that negotiation broke down, the KPP formed an alliance with the Muslim League and secured the support of the independent scheduled caste legislators. So in 1937, a Muslim Dalit alliance effectively thwarted the bid for power by the Savarna Hindu Bhadralok leadership of the Bengal Congress. Although Haq later joined the League and was given the privilege of introducing the Pakistan resolution at its Lahore session in 1940, his relationship with Jinnah was never cordial, and his willingness to forge cross-community political alliances had not diminished. It became evident when his ministry fell in 1943, he resigned from Muslim League and forged a new multi-party coalition with Shyama Prasad Mukherjee of Hindu Mahasabha. Sarad Bose of Congress was also supposed to join, but he was arrested before that could happen. This progressive coalition ministry, popularly known as the Shyama Haq ministry, was brought down in the following year by the machinations of the Bengal governor and the European lobby, which wanted a new Muslim League ministry. However, Nilesh Bose has mentioned that before resignation, Fazlul Haq had written a letter to the statesman, reiterating his unwavering faith in the Lahore resolution. His point of difference with Jinnah and the central leadership of the Muslim League was not in his rejection of Pakistan, but in his assertion of the distinctiveness of Bengal. What was applicable to Punjab might not work in Bengal, he argued. But it was also true that this brand of Bengali Pakistanism, as Sartori has called it, with the proposal of power sharing, did not have many takers among his own community at this stage. His joining hands with Hindu Mahasabha did not endear him to his own community, and his fall from grace in Bengali Muslim politics started from this point. But even at this stage, there was no territorial claim for a separate sovereign state, not until 1946, as Aisha Jalal forcefully argued. Until then, Jinnah's main demands were for parity of representation for the Congress and the League, irrespective of the size of the population they represented, and the exclusive right for the League to represent all Indian Muslims. Congress was unwilling to accept these demands, as it claimed to represent all Indians, irrespective of religion or caste. On this ground, therefore, broke down two attempts at reconciliation, one by Congress through the Rajagopalachari formula in September 1944, and the other by Viceroy Wavell wanting to form a cross-party interim government at the Shimla Conference in June-July 1945. We now know very clearly that at this stage, for Jinnah and Muslim League, the demand for parity was non-negotiable, but demand for Pakistan was not. This was evident in their positive response to the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946, which rejected the demand for Pakistan, but proposed to set up India as a loose federation of states clustered into three groups. While Muslim League accepted the proposal, Congress first accepted it, and then Nehru rejected it as it preferred a strong centralized state, which it thought was necessary to preserve its fragile unity. Jinnah got frustrated, lost faith in constitutional negotiations, and gave a call for direct action to fight his way to Pakistan. For a long time, historiography of partition related it only to this high politics. Aisha Jalal forcefully argued that Pakistan was Jinnah's bargaining chip and that he did not really want partition until the very end. Jalal, it seems, was putting too much emphasis on the agency of a single leader. In Bengal too, the question of agency remained a contentious issue. Joya Chatterjee proposed to take the discussion of partition away from the smoke-filled rooms of high politics to the towns and countryside of Bengal, where the movement that led to partition actually happened. In response, Parthu Chatterjee argued that the decision to partition Bengal was entirely negotiated and decided in Delhi. It was, he asserted, I quote, historically inaccurate, unquote, to assume that masses had any role in it. Recent researchers, however, have questioned this overemphasis on high politics. David Gilmartin and Talbot had shown how a mass campaign was launched in Punjab to rally popular support for the demand for Pakistan. As the demand was never properly defined, it meant different things to different groups. The campaign established an organic connection between the desires and emotions of the masses and the aspirations and actions of the leaders around the symbolic issue of Pakistan. A mass mobilization campaign was also launched by the Bengal Muslim League to support the Pakistan demand. But unlike Punjab, where this campaign was led by religious leaders like Pirs and Sajjad Nasheens and had a distinctly religious flavor, in Bengal it was spearheaded by leaders who had a more secular approach to politics. To the rural masses in East Bengal, as Taj Hashmi has shown, it was presented as a peasant utopia, which could offer liberation from the oppression of the Hindu landlords and moneylenders. More recently, Shemonti Ghosh has shown how the members of the Purbo Pakistan Renaissance Society, as well as Bengal League leaders like Abul Hashim and Surawadi, appealed effectively to the Muslim middle classes and peasants alike by defending Pakistan in terms of the principles of social justice, self-representation, and freedom from all kinds of economic exploitation and social discrimination. Nilesh Bose has shown how for some literary figures of the Renaissance Society, Pakistan meant something even bigger. It meant liberation of the intellect. It was inspired by Islam, but not defined by it. It would entail self-determination for all minorities and not just the Muslims. There was a distinct element of Bengaliness in this conceptualization of Pakistan and a territorial vision of undivided Bengal within the projected Purbo Pakistan. The effectiveness of this campaign, in which Islam converged with the socialism of the East Bengali peasants, was well reflected in the results of the election of 1946, which Jinnah had projected as a plebiscite for Pakistan demand. Muslim League in Bengal won most of the Muslim seats, thus completely marginalizing KPP as a contender for Muslim constituencies. The result established League as the sole representative of the Bengali Muslims, and in Muslim League rhetoric, the demand for independent states mentioned in Lahore Resolution was now replaced with the demand for, I quote, a sovereign independent Muslim state. In the election of 1946, Congress too looked for a mandate for a united independent India and won most of the general seats, marginalizing its other contenders such as the Communist Party, Hindu Mahasabha, and the Scheduled Caste Federation. A Hindu mobilization drive for Akhand Bharat or Akhand Hindustan had already been launched in the late 1930s under the aegis of the Hindu Mahasabha, particularly after V.D. Savarkar became its president in 1938. The following year in February at the Provincial Hindu Conference in Khulna, he gave a call for mobilization and militarization of the Hindu nation to counter Muslim demands for Pakistan. Bengali Mahasabha leaders like Shama Prasad Mukherjee started touring East Bengal countryside, mobilizing Hindu peasants, including Dalit and Adivasi peasants, for Akhand Hindustan. The campaign helped the Congress, as in popular perceptions, there was not much difference between the Mahasabha and the Congress, as some Congress leaders were also actively involved in it. In response to this Hindu Sangathan, Muslim mobilization also picked up further momentum. This mobilization effort focused less on religious symbols and more on secular interests like representation and power. The culmination of these competing mobilization drives was the Dhaka riot of March 1941, which, according to Suranjan Das, marked the beginning of overt politicization of communal conflicts in Bengal, while previously such conflicts were more localized and intermittent. But we should also remember that this communal polarization was continually interrupted by the formation of the Shama Hawk Ministry in December 1941, the Quit India movement in 1942, and the famine of 1943, which sought to bridge the communal divide. It was indeed an unsettled time, full of social tension, which shrank the social space for negotiating difference. In this period, Rakesh Botubal has observed, I quote, a brutalization of consciousness which began with the famine, unquote. Janam Mukherjee has also recently argued that hunger, death, dehumanization, and a general feeling of despondency that the war and famine had engendered led to the psychological preparation for what happened in 1946, the year of the riots. The Great Calcutta Killing of August 1946 was the first of the partition riots, as Suranjan Das would describe it. And it has been studied in detail by Das himself, as well as by Botubal, and more recently by Janam Mukherjee, Narayaki Nakasato, Onnesha Roy, and Ranabir Samata. While previously the entire blame for this riot was put on the shoulders of the Muslim League and its leader H.S. Suravadi, the new research has shown that it was preceded and facilitated by inflammatory speeches flying from both sides, from the League as well as the Congress Mahasabha combined. There were anticipation and consequent preparations for violence among both the communities, the Muslims as well as the Hindus and Sikhs. And the situation was aggravated by participation of professional gundas or criminal elements, both Muslim and Hindu. The rioting crowds on both sides consisted of a cross-section of the population, both Bhadralok and the working classes. Nakasato has argued that the riot happened because of the existence of what Paul Grass would call a riot system, and the inaction of the security forces was due more to structural weaknesses of the administration caused by split authority and divided control over the law enforcement machinery rather than to the machinations of Suravati and the Muslim League ministry. According to official figures, 4,000 people were killed and 10,000 were injured in the Calcutta riot, besides enormous amounts of property being destroyed. This mayhem, in which all communities had blood on their hands, deeply scarred the social psyche of the Bengali population and destroyed the trust between the two communities. From here, Noakhali and Tripura, where another devastating riot was to take place in October 1946, was not very far. At Noakhali, the Muslims were in the offensive, and it resulted in the first wave of internal displacement of the East Bengali Hindus, but there is no evidence of the Muslim League's direct complicity in it. The Noakhali Tripura riot was the last of the pre-partition riots in Bengal that completed the process of politicization of communal violence, linking it to the broader organized subcontinental politics. Scholars like Bidut Chakraborty and Bashavi Fraser have forcefully argued that it was the fear generated by the Calcutta Noakhali riots that resulted in a separation of minds between the Hindus and the Muslims and ultimately led to the partition. But possibly even in 1946, the breach of trust between the two communities in Bengal had not reached the point of no return. The year had begun with unprecedented display of communal harmony in popular protest rallies on Rashid Ali Day on 11 February against the guilty verdict for the INA prisoner Captain Abdul Rashid. Gautam Chattopadhyay showed long ago that although initially called by the student wing of the Muslim League, the demonstrations were participated by the Congress and communist volunteers alike, and they fought pitched battles with the colonial police for 3 days with 3 flags flying, green, red, and tricolour. Onnesha Roy has recently documented that even during the Calcutta riot, despite widespread violence, there were numerous volunteer groups, the trade unions, political parties, neighborhood organizations, and individuals who were relentlessly working for reconciliation, communal harmony, and relief for the afflicted, irrespective of their community affiliation. Shemunti Ghosh points out that after the election of 1946, there was on the table a proposal for a coalition ministry between the League and the Congress. Even after the Calcutta riot, in August, there was a similar proposal for an all-parties government. And then in early 1947 came the proposal for a united sovereign Bengal from the Bengali League leader Abul Hashim and Suravati, supported by the dissident Congress leader Sarad Bose. But while Gandhi was ambivalent, the Congress High Command insisted on a unified, centralized Indian state, was vehemently opposed to this idea. However, despite these developments, which Ghosh calls, I quote, other histories, unsettling the narrative of a complete breakdown of social ties, unquote, partition did happen. Because by these closing months of colonial rule, the political polarization and the competing aspirations and apprehensions of the two situational minorities had reached such a stalemate that partition seemed to be the only way out. Historians have differed in their reading of the political situation in these last months. In the year of the riots, Rakesh Botobal detected, I quote, the hegemonic presence of the communal ideology, unquote, among the Bengali Muslim population. Chanda Chatterjee has seen, I quote, jihadi psychology of the Muslim League ministries, unquote, operating during this period. Scholars like Tajin Murshid, Semunti Ghosh and Nilesh Bose, who have studied Bengali Muslim writing and politics of this period more closely, have presented a more nuanced reading of the situation. At this stage, they point out, the Bengali Muslim leadership remained vigorously opposed to the Congress proposal of a centralized Indian state, because in such a future state, their political aspirations for self-representation as a minority would surely be smothered. but their concept of Pakistan was not a demand for partition. They were also wary of the centralism of the League High Command. They visualized undivided Bengal as constituting Purba Pakistan, which would be able to relate on equal terms to the western part as well as to the rest of India. It sounded more like the idea of federation which Chittaranjan Das had once championed. The Bengal Scheduled Caste Federation, led by Jogendranath Mandal, represented another minority group. As Doipa and Sen has recently shown, they also aligned with the League, opposed partition, and believed that a Muslim Dalit alliance offered the best chance for their deliverance from the domination of the Savarna Bhadralok elite. But on the other hand, the Hindu Bhadralok, representing a demographic minority within the specific regional context of Bengal, seriously apprehended that in a Muslim majority Bengal, a possible Muslim Dalit alliance would permanently reduce them to the position of a minority, forever excluded from the power. It was also true that not until Jinnah's inaugural speech in the Pakistan Constituent Assembly that Muslim League had provided any clarification about the position of the minorities in its imagined Pakistan. Both Joy Chatterjee and Parthu Chatterjee in a recent article have agreed that it was this fear which prompted the latter to propose partition of Bengal to create a Hindu majority province of West Bengal within the Indian Union. In her recent book, Chanda Chatterjee has claimed that the decision to partition Bengal was to salvage, I quote, at least the western districts of Bengal from the nightmare of the past 10 years of Muslim League rule, unquote. Before her, Bidut Chakraborty too had thought that the role of the Bengal ministries was crucial in this unfolding story of partition. But what did the Muslim League ministries actually do to hurt the Hindus? In Chakraborty's own words, and I quote, the drive of the Muslim leadership to secure the privileges of the hitherto depressed socio-economic community, namely the Muslims, at the cost of the Hindus, was what decisively shaped the articulation of the demand for partition. So the culpability of the Muslim League ministries, as Suranjan Das has argued in a recent article, lay in their attempt to rebalance an existing imbalance of power through a series of legislative interventions in the fields of agriculture, education, employment, and local self-government. This was resisted by those who wielded power until recently. To garner popularity, Mukherjee at this stage launched a vigorous campaign. On 4th of April 1947, the Bengal Congress accepted the proposal to partition Bengal. Between 4 and 6th April, at a conference in Tarokeshwar, Mahasabha leaders outlined their program for a mass campaign. The leaders moved in this direction, as Yasmin Khan suggests, because a cross-section of the Bengali Bhadralok demanded partition of the province to protect their interests and avert any enforcement of, to avert any unforeseen social catastrophe. My own research shows that many scheduled caste leaders opposed to Mandal also joined the campaign. Chanda Chatterjee has claimed that the Mahasabha and Mukherjee played the leading role in this movement, but we need to remember that following the Quit India movement in 1942, the political strength of the Mahasabha was shrinking. And in the election of 1946, it was practically decimated with a vote share of less than 3%. So the movement would not succeed, as Joy Chatterjee has claimed, if Congress had not supported it. Indeed, the Bengal Congress was the senior partner in this partition campaign, as its central leadership gave an approving nod. And the movement was most powerful in the Hindu majority districts of Western Bengal. On 3rd June, the Viceroy announced the partition proposal. There was no surprise when on 20th June 1947, at the meeting of the Bengal Legislative Assembly, the majority of its Hindu members, including most of the scheduled caste members, voted for partition. They possibly did not foresee that as a result of this political decision, the lives of about 20 million ordinary Bengali people, both Hindu and Muslim, on both sides of the new border would be completely disrupted due to no fault of their own. Willem van Schendel has documented the pain and the extent of this disruption in his book, The Bengal Borderland. Bengal thus moved towards partition through a complex, winding trajectory. As I would like to summarize, there was a clash of competing fears of two situational minorities, the Bengali Muslims and the Hindu Bhadralok. One fearing the centralized domination of a pan-Indian Hindu majority, and the other fearing the domination of a regional Muslim majority. Possibly the only way out of this clash of mutual fear was partition. It was my contention in my book on decolonization that when power was handed over to the two dominions in August 1947, the nation-building process had by no means completed in the subcontinent. It was this imperative of nation-building which ensured that partition would have a long afterlife. As now, a reciprocal fear of minorities triggered a huge migration of people. But unlike Punjab, the refugee influx in Bengal did not happen in one go, but in successive waves. The policies of refugee rehabilitation also differed as a result. The experiences of the refugees varied, and they remember it and nurture a sense of loss in myriad ways. A large body of literature has been produced on this long aftermath of partition. It can be divided into three genres: the refugee studies, memory studies, and studies on cultural representation. I do not intend to go into any discussion of this literature now, as I will require another lecture for that. I will only conclude by making a brief comment on the issue of public memorialization of partition, as this lecture is to celebrate the establishment of the Kolkata Partition Museum. Collective memory of an event, which is in the first instance individual, eventually gets abstracted and institutionalized through museums and exhibitions to become the cultural memory of a nation or a wider community. But such public memorialization also offers its own challenges. In view of apparently unconflicted separation between the oppressor and the oppressed, in the case of the Holocaust, it is relatively easy to memorialize such an event while grappling with the idea of ascription of blame and victimhood. But partition, where the distinction between the perpetrator and the victim was blurry, it becomes infinitely more complex and problematic. In his 2001 book, Remembering Partition, Gyanendra Pandey had argued that the memory of violence can only be institutionalized through museums where we can distance ourselves from it, as it happened in Germany. In his view, anything like a Holocaust museum did not appear in India because partition violence continued to be a part of quotidian life in recent history. But I would argue that in a situation where individual memories of loss can be so easily appropriated into a discourse of communal animosity, such memorialization is more necessary. In the messy narrative of partition, there were many twists and turns and much ambiguity that obscures any definitive ascription of blame. It is necessary to communicate these nuances to the wider public to preempt any reductionist reading of history. It may help us to come to terms with the violence of partition by recognizing its reciprocal nature. Such memorialization may therefore perform a pedagogic function by disrupting the memory practices that perpetuate collective memories of unchallenged feelings of hate and animosity between and among conflicting groups. It may, one can hope, initiate a process of closure and lead to some kind of reconciliation. There is, of course, a danger of such a public exhibition being viewed as a fixed, authoritative version of history. But such a likelihood can possibly be avoided by consciously emphasizing the fluidity and plurality of historical interpretations. The opening of the Amritsar Museum on 17th August 2017, some 70 years after partition, has initiated in a modest way the process of memorializing partition in India. A separate museum for Bengal is clearly necessary, so I welcome the establishment of the virtual museum as a first step, and I wish it all success. I will end here. Thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you, Professor Bandyopadhyay, for this enlightening lecture. The floor is now open to questions. Please raise your hand if you have any questions.
Sir, I have a question, sir. Yes, sir. So, Ambedkar, as we know, had initially given his go-ahead to Jogendranath Mondol for his plan of coalition with the Muslim League because he had visualized that the Dalits had a better chance of survival in the state of Pakistan. But later he withdrew from his position, as we know. So what is the exact historical juncture when Ambedkar changed his position?
Yes, Dr. Ambedkar shifted his position. He wrote a book initially justifying the Pakistan demand, and for a long time Muslim League used that book for publicizing the justification of the partition demand. But eventually, I would possibly suspect, after the Simla Conference of 1945, Ambedkar began to realize, or came to a point where he thought that the Muslim League was trying to monopolize the minority position, and Muslim League projecting itself as the major minority would jeopardize the chances and entitlements of other minorities like the scheduled castes. So he could see a possible conflict of interest between a dominant minority and an underdog minority. And that is why he began to change his position, his number of statements on that. And after the partition, he came up with specific statements that the scheduled castes who were in Pakistan must come out. And because you have no future, because the Muslim League was going to dominate that state. And this is where I thought he was deviating from Jogin Mandal as well. Jogin Mandal, on the other hand, made a public statement that after partition, the scheduled caste in India would be worse off under dominant Hindu domination. So they would be much better off by staying put in East Bengal. And that is why the East Bengal Dalit peasants did not migrate immediately after 1947. Was Ambedkar supporting it? Now, we do not have any direct evidence. We have only one evidence, which his son presents in a book he published. He published a typed letter from Ambedkar, where Ambedkar is supporting Mandal's position, but that is the only documentary evidence we have. But obviously Mandal too changed his position after 1950 when he himself migrated, because I think the whole thing changed after Pakistan moved towards becoming an Islamic republic. And when Pakistan announced itself as an Islamic republic, that marginalization of the other minorities started. And there the other disenchantment began, and they began to migrate, and that migration happens between 1950 and 1957.
Sekhar, Professor Bandyopadhyay, you did refer to what I'm just about to say towards the end of your lecture. I'd just like to go back to the opening moments of your lecture when you spoke about historiography and the mutations in historiography, partition historiography, and that constructed or continues to construct the event of partition. From a literary point of view, I would just like to say that literature has its own historiography, and that the refractions of experience, of partition experience through literature, the most iconic and absolutely unforgettable writer vis-a-vis this point that I'm making is Sadat Hasan Manto. And if one has read his stories, Khol Do What Exing, then I think they become very iconic statements about statements or explorations or signatures of the partition experience.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have no dispute with what you said, but I very purposefully did not go into the literature. I decided to stick to the historical literature only, and even for that I took about 1 hour, and I did not want to try your patience by going into other. I mean, it's true, you are absolutely right, the contemporary literature and later literary works on the partition, they bring out various aspects of it. But I would put it as part of the aftermath of partition. And in this lecture, I did not go into the aftermath. I stopped in August 47. And my concern here is that historians have interpreted the story in very different ways. And of course, there is no single authentic interpretation, and it will depend on which side of the line you are. As I said, when the Radcliffe line was drawn, its meanings were different to different people, depending on who you are and where you stood. And therefore, to arrive at an authentic history is difficult. But everyone constructs his own interpretation, her own interpretation. My purpose in this lecture, I'm not sure whether I could communicate it clearly, I see it as a problem of minority. The partition happened, particularly in Bengal, is a reflection of the problem of dealing with minority. We still don't know how to deal with the minority. And Appadurai has very clearly argued that this is the Achilles' heel of all modern nation states. We do not know what to do with our minorities because all nations look for ethnic purity, which is unachievable, but everyone tries to achieve it. And that leads to conflict. And what I argue that in the Bengal situation, there were two minorities, whom I call the two situational minorities. The Muslims were a minority in the All India context, and the Hindu Bhandralok were a minority in the regional Bengal context. And the two minorities had different kinds of apprehensions about what would happen if we are under a brute majority domination. And these majorities were not sufficiently sensitive to their apprehensions. They were not sufficiently accommodative about their aspirations. And that is where it comes to a point when no one can adjust to each other. So it's a kind of two minority apprehensions coming to an inevitable clash. And everyone at that point of time thought that partition would be a way out. But obviously they did not anticipate that partition would create new minorities. You cannot completely get rid of minorities. No nation states can. And we have to learn with how to deal with the minorities.
This and communist role regarding partition, special reference to M.N. Rai's alternative constitution, which visualized a federal state united India.
Yes, sir. The leftists, particularly the Communist Party, was going under what is known as the Adhikari formula, and where at one point of time they accepted the Pakistan demand in the sense when Pakistan was not really conceptualized as a separate nation state. Pakistan was considered to be more a cultural federation with regional autonomy within the broader federation. And the leftist position, particularly the Communist Party's position, was that the minority position should be recognized, should be accommodated, and so on. But at the same time, and strategically, they were also trying to bring together the two groups and reconcile the two groups, which by 1946 became an exercise in futility. Because other factors were going in so many different directions that the Communist Party, in a way, was not being able to deal with it. And that exactly happens immediately after partition. Immediately after partition, particularly when the violent riots took place in Punjab and some in Bengal in the 46, Communist Party had not really developed a strategy to deal with this violent situation. So Communist Party almost remained as a wayside watcher of what was happening. We do not see much active role of the Communist Party in this situation because they did not, the Adhikari formula did not really conceptualize how to strategize to deal with this violence. And this continued into the 1948 the convention, the Calcutta Convention of the Communist Party, which it declared that this independence is fake, and they went for a different kind of revolution. So, in other words, and number of scholars who have worked on the leftist positions during this particular moment of division, this crisis, have argued, like Nossiter, I can immediately remember Nossiter and others, have argued that the Communist Party could not develop any concrete strategy to deal with this violence, which would be different from the other political parties like Congress, Masawat, etc. So that was one of the unfortunate aspects of this situation, that nobody came with any workable formula through which this growing rift could be reconciled. And the forces on the other side were becoming increasingly so strong that the reconciliation processes or efforts were not going anywhere. Although there were many such efforts, as I mentioned, the trade unions were, even during the Calcutta riot, was trying to contain the situation.
But sir,
thank you very much for...
In 46, there was a voting for whether they want the partition or not in Bengal. Communists has voted for the partition. Ratodhan Brahma and Jyoti Basu. They have voted for the partition.
No. So far as I know, they did not vote for the partition. The Communist Party abstained from the vote. I'm not sure, but so far as I remember...
They have voted, sir.
I have question marks. I have to check, but so far as I remember, it was the communist members who abstained from voting.
On the declaration of 14th August by the Government of India as Partition Horrors Remembrance Day.
Please don't drag me into contemporary politics. Thank you very much. You know I know, but I don't want to go there.
Which is another August Revolution.
Yes.
Now, the catastrophic slide from February 1946, when there was unprecedented communal harmony manifested in the Calcutta uprisings, immortally penned by Shukantini's quakes, to the August calamity. This slide perhaps has been neglected by historians. If it could be sustained, and one must remember that almost at this point of time, the Imperial Navy mutiny and Imperial Air Force mutinies were also taking place. And there was a massive, vast, fermented discontent in the subcontinent. Airship strikes, firings, and all the rest of it. If this could be sustained and galvanized into a kind of broader protest, perhaps the slide towards communal divisiveness could be halted. Your opinion?
As I tried to show that there were different kind of forces and operation at the same time. When the communal riot was taking place in August, even then there were efforts to reconcile. There were a number of groups. Amnesha Roy's excellent book has documented how different groups, even during the riot of August 1946, were trying to bring reconciliation, were trying to help the victims irrespective of their religion, and wanting to kind of contain this situation. But the problem was there were two sides, different forces working at the same time. And after August 46, August 46 riot was catastrophic. And most of the historians argue that what happened in 1946 actually broke that trust between the two communities. But some of the historians, Shemonti Ghosh, has shown that even after August 46, there were attempts to reconciliation, but people began to question those efforts, whether it at all can be done. So in other words, by that time, this mutual fear had become so strong that it was difficult to reconcile. So there were parallel streams of political actions were going on. That's why I called it the tortuous road to partition. It was not a straightforward road to communal polarization. When the communal polarization was taking place, there were many things were happening which was indicating other histories of reconciliation, understanding, and so on. But ultimately it did not happen. That's the factual kind of deal.
Thank you, Professor Bandyopadhyay. I like the very important point that you made, that partition in some ways was not over, the territorial division, that in some ways, of course, it begins. And Joya Chatterjee's group has done wonderful work in talking about how the very definitions of citizenship are opened up for discussion in the aftermath of that event. In that context, we're looking at very important points that you emphasize about minorities. Wouldn't you say that there is, your interest in the histories of valid influence? In fact, one tragedy is that for the largest minority in India, the Muslims, that in fact after 47 there's a foreclosure of all kinds of other conversations that had just barely begun in the 1930s, mainly along the lines of caste within the Muslim community. Right? So I'm thinking of the All India Movement Conference. And it's just begun in the 1930s, and even the British had no idea who on earth the movements were. Right? And that's something that today those who speak about the Pasmanda Muslims still aren't able to open up, because suddenly the Muslim must demonstrate unity rather than acknowledging, I suppose, acknowledging practice. So, is that the experience in some ways of Dalit conversation?
My understanding of the whole political movement of identity is that identity is not a fixed thing. Identity is constructed, reconstructed, muted, and transmuted in different contexts continuously within specific contexts. And as I have tried to argue, and many people don't like that argument which I made, that even when we look at Dalit movement, no Dalit movement was ever a homogeneous movement. We wear many hats. We live with many identities. And different identities become politically more powerful in different contexts. So, identity is conjunctural, it is contextual. So obviously, at one point of time, what looked like a homogeneous Muslim identity in 1946-47 contained within it many other fissures. And those fissures began to come to the surface once again when that first conflict was over. I mean, if we look at the Bengal Muslim situation, from the 19th century onwards, when this homogeneous identity was being constructed, there was a major division between the Ashraf and the Azlaf. And the Muslim mobilization campaign very consciously tried to bridge the gap. They tried to construct a homogeneous identity through various strategies. By selling Pakistan demand as a peasant utopia. And so, as Sartori and Bose has very powerfully argued, that Islam and socialism for these Bengali Muslims were kind of merging behind the partition demand. But that does not mean that the fissures had gone. That does not mean that other identities like the linguistic identity had gone, which also Bose and Sartori have very consciously argued that for the Bengali Muslims this Pakistanism was Bengali Pakistanism. Sartori uses that term. So when the first initial struggle was over, in the second stage, in a new historical context, those things came up. In the same way, I have seen in the Namashudra movement, at one point of time, it was a homogeneous movement in the 1880s and until 1930s. But they also had divisions within it. And also, we need to look at these identity politics from an intersectional perspective. When we look at identity in terms of community like caste or religion, we also have to position with other identities like class, gender, and so on. So all these identities kind of clash with each other in different historical contexts. So identity politics is essentially contextual and conjunctural. And that's why the fissures reappear in different forms.
Sir, it is said that the events of 1971 in Bangladesh conclusively proved the failure of the so-called two-nation theory. Now, after 75 years of 1947, in your opinion, the Bengali Muslims of East Bengal, now Bangladesh, the question may be hypothetical, do you think they are now better off with partition having taken place in 1947?
I think after 1947, the situation of East Bengal has gone through so many shifts and turns. That what we find today in Bangladesh, it is difficult to relate it to the 1947. We are working on a book, Rituparna and Joyanto Sengupta is here, we are working in a book and we have an article on how the Bangladeshis remember 1947. In Bangladeshis memory, 1947 has been replaced by 1971. It is 1971 which is more important. Because from 1947 they have come such a long way. And so many changes have taken place that it is very difficult to relate it to 247. So whether they are better off because of partition, I think it's very difficult to answer. At least I cannot answer it. Because what is happening today in Bangladesh is the result of the historical process since 47, or I would say since 71. Because 71 was a definite watershed moment for that part of the world.
Thank you, Professor Bandyopadhyay, for such an enriching and enthralling lecture. Thank you, Dr. Roy, for inviting the Department of History, Presidency University, to collaborate with the Kolkata Partition Museum Trust for this inaugural lecture of the annual lecture series. On behalf of the Department of History Seminar Committee, I would like to extend a very warm note of thanks to our HOD, Dr. Salim Zawed, the convener of the seminar committee, Dr. Oindula Sarkar, and Dr. Kishan Harijan, along with all the student and scholar members of the committee. I would like to thank the Honorable Vice Chancellor, the Registrar, the Dean of Students, the Finance Officer, and the Development Officer for helping us in organizing the seminar. I would also like to extend warm greetings and thank the respected faculty members of the department as well as the scholars and students who have joined us today. Thank you all.